You're listening to episode 175 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gary Gach speaks with us today about Sila, the pro-social behaviors of Buddhism. Right speech, right action, right livelihood. Recent events around radical, violent activities from Buddhist monastics in Myanmar has stirred some controversy about the validity of Buddhist practice. It seems that Buddhism isn't really what it's all cracked up to be if monks are encouraging violence, let alone enacting it themselves. But are they behaving according to the precepts of their tradition? This is a slippery slope as we run the risk of falling into the no true Scotsman fallacy. No real Buddhist would do these things. To really understand what is and is not acceptable action from someone identifying as Buddhist, it might help to learn a bit about Sila, the ethical conduct portion of the Eightfold Path. Gary Gach is an American author, translator, editor, and teacher and poet living on Russian Hill, San Francisco. His work has been translated into several languages and has appeared in several anthologies and numerous periodicals. He serves on the International Advisory Panel of the Buddhist Channel, a Malaysian Buddhist news website. A member of the Order of Interbeing, he teaches mindfulness in the tradition of Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh at the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples. He currently hosts Haiku Corner for Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Surly Furious. And our guest today is our friend returning for his second conversation on the Secular Buddhist podcast, Gary Gach. Gary, thanks for being here.
Hello, good to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about a rather broad topic that I'm glad you're joining us to discuss, and that is ethics, and what we sometimes refer to in a traditional context as Sila, as one of the main three parts of the Eightfold Path, to get numerical about it for a moment. Gary, as we talk about ethics, Buddhist ethics specifically, why don't you give us a brief outline of what you mean by that when you discuss it?
I don't have any personal slant on it. I kind of agree with what you said. It's a third of the Eightfold Path, along with the wisdom tradition and meditation. One of the things that I do personally notice is how a couple of things. One, in the West, we're kind of been learning it backwards from the way the East does, who start with the ethical traditions, building upon that base to learn the wisdom traditions based in action, so that they can have those two as twin supports for their contemplative meditation. We in the West dive into contemplative practice. Then we try to understand, well, what's non-self and inner being and inner permanence? And somewhere along the line seem to go, wait a minute, there's Sila, Vinaya, what's that?
What do we mean by that?
What's that? What's up with that?
Yeah, that comes up a bit in one of the pushbacks that folks have around programs that are just meditation, and that is certainly a very important and indeed pivotal component to our overall practice is meditation and the pieces of that, whether we're talking about samatha or vipassana, whether we're talking about insight or whatever kinds of meditation practices we do. There's also these components of understanding and of social behaviors. Breaking that out a little bit, of course, speech we have in its most basic level, avoiding or abstaining from false speech or slanderous speech or harsh speech or idle chatter. Right action as abstaining from taking life or taking what is not given and abstaining from sexual misconduct. And right livelihood it gets a little dicey, of course, because that was within a cultural context where the kinds of livelihood were not perhaps as varied as they are today, but he specifically narrowed it down to dealing in weapons, living beings, which included raising animals for slaughters and the slave trade and prostitution, things like that, meat production and butchery, poisons and intoxicants. And so there are also some other things dealing with dishonest means, like soothsaying and trickery and things like that we should also avoid. But basically, if you're following the other ethical practices, you're covered for livelihood, it seems.
Were it that easy, yeah.
If only it were. So you mentioned that you had an outline of some things that you wanted to chat about.
Not really an outline, just a couple of points. Like, for example, just before we began talking, I did my little poll. I went to Google and I looked up Buddhist meditation, Buddhist wisdom, Buddhist ethics. Meditation, 17 million hits. Buddhist, you ready? This is my informal poll. Buddhist wisdom, 12 million hits. Buddhist ethics, 7.6 million. It's
a bit less.
It's in English. It's just not yet taken hold. And one way to think about it is people say, mindfulness is being in the present moment. Well, a safecracker has to be in the present moment. And so how do you introduce the concept of metta, of kindness, of dana, generosity, these codes of conduct? Another thing you said, which I find interesting, is there's a saying. It's like from the Dhammapada. So we think it's a direct quote of the Buddha, where it's just very simply avoid evil, do good, and keep a clear mind. And he doesn't just say do good. And he doesn't just say avoid evil. He says both. And one way to say that is maybe that avoid evil is the ethics and the do good is understanding the wisdom tradition. Keeping a clear mind is the meditative. But there are both sides to the ethics, and it tends to be kind of things that people shy away from, I think, partly because they are framed as the Decalogue are. Thou shalt not.
Right.
Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. And yet, they all can be framed positively. Non-harming, Albert Schweitzer called reverence for life. The one about intoxicants, you could say nourishment and healing. The one about not slandering, gossiping, or if you will, lying, could be loving speech and deep listening. So that there are practices that, so to be personal, you were asking me how does Gary Gach see these? I was the difference between before I was a Buddhist and after I was a Buddhist, and I call myself a Buddhist, is when I took refuge. I not only took refuge in the Triple Gem, but in the precepts. It's a kind of a traditional form for many of the sanghas that you want to be initiated in the tribe. Here's the code of the tribe. And for mine, we call them mindfulness trainings. We can have a link to them for people who want to look them up. This is how Thich Nhat Hanh and the Sangha together have kind of rubbed beards and rubbed heads and thought about how do we reframe these for the 21st century? And not only reframing them in terms of positive things, but yeah, what about mindful consuming of media? I find that they're, because I practice them, when I say I practice them, I've taken refuge in them, and every month I look at them and I recite them with my Sangha. And we consider it a mirror. That is, it's not only a boat or the ocean that floats our boat or a torch that lights our way, but as a mirror, when I hear them and I recite them and I chant them and I hear them with one mind and one voice and one ear with my community, I notice what comes up for me, and I notice what I notice. And conversely, if I notice, for example, oh, I notice this about other people. Well, I notice that because it's a mirror of my own behavior right now. So it's a really vital, viable way of maintaining the practice in action, as you say, in social conduct, as well as in relation to myself and in relation, to all beings. I think what's interesting, and this may be kind of the hit word for our talk, is that it's crowdsourcing. you know, I mean, if you think about it, Franz Metcalf has a book, What Would Buddha Do? And that's very apt, and it's a nice turning of the What Would Jesus Do movement. But it isn't just what would Buddha do, it's what do we all do? What do we do? What does Gary Gach do? What does Ted Meisner do? What do you do? What do we each do in this situation that no one else has ever been in before, perhaps, with the particular choices that we have to make in our life? And so what the Vinaya, the Sila, for us represent aren't something written in stone that came down from a mountain from a heavenly messenger, but crowdsourcing. This is what, the original community Sangha said, well, this will promote whole feelings, and these tend to promote, negative consequences. And we still are discovering them. I mean, if it wasn't something that's bottom up rather than top down, how the heck did, not having intercourse with apes get into it? Well, some monk in there, must have committed bestiality. And so they put that down. So we find it's not something that we have to consider, the daunting finger in the sky, thou shalt not, but rather it's liberation for me. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful source of true happiness and joy and love and all those reasons, that I've come to this path, and I continue.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Vinaya and the rules for monastics. But they're as reputed, there are lots and lots and lots of them, literally hundreds of them, and many of them are based on the actions of, as I recall, one particular monk was the backstory for a lot of these rules. And really what we see in the high level view, and one of the reasons that I like the Eightfold Path and its views of understanding and social action, how we relate to one another out in the world, and our practices of getting better at those kinds of things as we divide up the Eightfold Path that way. There are these very root concepts that, Gary, as you're saying, they're not a finger in the air, thou shalt nots. They're not prescriptions. They're really pointing to cause and effect. And this is part of the understanding piece of this, is that there are consequences to our actions, whatever those may be. And we can certainly judge them from a moralistic standpoint of good and evil. Or we can simply refer to them as consequences without that sort of judgment behind them. But these are the the guidelines to behaviors, to what we do with one another, that seem to have the greatest likelihood of benefit to self and others. That's what I find very fascinating and wonderful about them, is that they're helpful to us, because sometimes we need that check. We're a little bit blinded by our own particular interests and our aversions, and this is simply a very helpful guide for us.
Amen. I mean, I had an experience. I was on a bus, Chinatown bus, a crowded bus, and I thought I was meditating so well. Yet, I mean, and I thought I was just interbeing so well and aware of the impermanence of everything so well. And I got up and I stepped on somebody's foot and they went, ouch. And it's that ouch that becomes the koan, or one of the turning phrases of practice, where otherwise I don't know where development occurs. Buddha is the idea of transformation. The wisdom tradition is something that's timeless, even though it's about impermanence. And meditation isn't necessarily something that one does better, you know, or best than anybody else, or that one has done. It is what it is. But this is the kind of the mirror of well, if I'm perfect, where do I stand a little improvement? And I really like how you're also you're really on the dime about that. It's not about evil, good and evil. My
Right, right,
godfather
right.
right now has asked me about Sandy Hook, and I sent him something, by the Buddhist monk who grew up in Newton. I don't know if you've seen the letter to the shooter.
Yeah, I did. One of the other bloggers, not on our site but on another, had posted that. So I did look at it, and one of the things that made it, as I recall, somewhat controversial when it came out was that it was really calling for a very broad compassion, and that the what we were seeing didn't occur in a vacuum, and it wasn't because this individual was evil or possessed or otherwise a bad person, but they're also part of just this ongoing sequence of cause and effects, and in particular, I suspect, of not having adequate access to mental health and getting the assistance they need to cause other consequences, and like this not happening at all. And that's very difficult for people because we have a very strong emotional reaction to that.
And we have, and my godfather is like, "Where's evil? I read this whole thing, and where's evil?" And I said, "It's not in it." Which I think kind of, I'm sending him now. Please call me by my true names by Thich Nhat Hanh, which, as you know, was written when after the war in Vietnam, and America pulled out. Then there's all these boat people who are trapped on small boats on perilous seas and being, you know, beset upon by pirates. And he doesn't call the pirate evil. He builds to it very slowly by talking about the grass snake that feeds on the frog, and this kind of yin yang of nature that we are all a part of. But he talks about the pirate's heart not yet being open. The door to compassion is not yet being open, because I think the saving grace is otherwise one opens a wound that never stops bleeding when one says evil, and it has to be what punished, and how do you stop it, and then it's inconsolable. You're right. It takes evil out of the equation, looks at things in terms of cause and effect, or karma, and that's how then the wisdom tradition comes in. The interesting thing, another thing I kind of put on the table, is the interbeing nature of both the three aspects of the Eightfold Path, how you touch one, you touch the others, and so how if you just touch one of the precepts or the mindfulness trainings, you touch all the others. So that it isn't something that you necessarily have to take on all at once. They mutually support each other. So understanding, for example, how action is based on thought, and so right action is dependent on wisdom. Because if my thought is based on separateness and all the kind of wrong view, then my words will reflect that, and my actions will reflect that.
Yeah, and that's where we get uh, a little concerned with the fact that in many places where a meditative practice is taught and done, is that if it is separated from that context, from that more broad understanding of cause and effect and these guidelines of, I would say, pro-social behavior, that we then can lead to things like, as you're describing, the killer needing to be focused when he's doing his thing, which isn't really a good thing, and that we really do need to have that full comprehension, so that we're not just developing a great concentration and a great awareness while we still do jerky things.
The scandals that we read about and so forth, they all kind of reflect this not having yet appreciated.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a few minutes, because that's a good segue. And of course, we don't want to shy away from or hide the kinds of things that have been happening lately, because I think those things continue and foster when there's an avoidance of them. So I really don't support the idea of not talking about them.
And here's an interesting, as we segue into that, I'll tell you an interesting thing. I've been the Western advisory panelist for the Buddhist Channel, which had been, sometimes is the largest Buddhist site on the web, depending on the tides. And it publishes the daily news from around the world, both readers in the East and readers in the West. And we have gotten into some interesting situations about right speech, the ethics of journalism. Should we or shouldn't we publish? For example, when there was the whole Ajahn, uh, the ordination of the nuns,
The Bhikkhunis, Ajahn Brahm, when he did
Ajahn
that in
Brahm.
Australia, yeah.
Yeah, and then both sides kept sending us news releases every hour. So what we did was we said the Buddhist Channel is now maintaining noble silence for 24 hours. It went dark. There was no news. You want news? Make some of your own. Go out and make some news, And, and you think about, for example, how much the media preys upon bad news and wrong speech in terms of, you know, um, violence and sex and all the tendencies that we have, for which we have the conscious conduct, mindfulness training precepts, Sila and Vinaya, rather than reporting good news. You know. So, on that note, before I ever enter into talking about things that perhaps I don't know about firsthand or that are of any controversial nature, I always kind of invoke my own sense of not wanting to go down a path that's very tempting, but rather to talk about it in terms of um, clarity, compassion, wisdom.
Yeah, so bearing that in mind, because I agree, and this is one of the points about which in these topics, I do think it would be very helpful for us to remember that, at least ostensibly, we live in a country here in the U.S. where we have this concept of being innocent until proven guilty, which I am a firm supporter of. And I think we don't say enough in our regular engagements, it's okay to not know, and to say, I don't know what happened, and I can't really speak in with any sort of clear sense of judgment about them without even an oblique sense of the facts. So that's one of the reasons why what I'd prefer we do is not so much talk about these specific instances, which are well talked about in other locations, but to talk about some of the things that have led to them and some of the effects and how they relate to ethics. So as we talk about the bad behaviors, shall we say, of people in positions of power, when there's a differentiation in our in any kind of institutional setting, it doesn't have to be a religious one, it could be a political one or others,
And
where there's a power
hierarchy.
difference, where there's some sort of hierarchy, we see abuses of various kinds. And recently there have been allegations of sexual misconduct. And what I'm finding odd and is difficult to grapple with, although understanding a bit about human nature, I can see how this has happened, is that there's a power difference and people are not perfect and they do bad things. And what surprises me more is, and this is what I was referring to, where these things thriving in the dark, and why I think we need to talk about them openly, is that these were apparently, allegedly, well known abuses of power that were nonetheless not discussed, not brought to light, and and really avoided rather than corrected as harmful actions that hurt people. So, Gary, why don't you tell us some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you nailed it. I mean, there are documents that fill two CDs for one of these, so that I can't speak as if I don't know that there's been very, very hurtful damage, but also um, as much shenanigans behind the scene as a kind of a spy story with cover-ups and betrayals and casting a blind eye and so forth. And um, we can throw a link to them if you want, but I think you're right. It's more um, besides the particular. It leads to the questions of the general, which, as you framed correctly, I think it have to do with power and hierarchy. But also, I would go back to something you'd said a couple of beats ago about the Vinaya being monastic. And like you, I'm a layperson, and yet I'm a practitioner. I believe in the fourfold sangha of laymen and laywomen and monks and nuns, and I don't think Westerners had or have yet to fully appreciate, for example, how much is expected of them and how much is expected of the monks and nuns. That as a monk and a nun, on the one hand, you don't have all the choices that a layperson might have every day, dealing with corporate culture, dealing with this or that. On the other hand, um, the, the, the monk or the nun has now all of these temptations of dealing with lay people, which they in the West, and people who are innocent. So I think that's part of one way that I kind of look at this dynamic, in which I've seen too many cases that I could enumerate on many levels. Where like we need to grow up, and in doing so, we need. I'm saying practitioners, people really interested in, um, a this is being part of our life.
Yeah, positive
Being our life.
change. Yeah.
And that it behooves us to really consider that our stance towards precepts and meditation and prajna insight aren't three separate things. That the nature and function of them are all the same. So to look at these things. They need certainly the Sangha needs to find ways of nonviolent communication and having, um, for example, our Sangha, we have a whole system for this. I don't think in some of the cases where it's occurred, it was there. Just people sent letters to each other and memos to each other, or people looked at each other and shrugged. And but this is precisely where the Vinaya occurs. It's crowdsourcing.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the things that we might need to round out our rubber hits the road on Sila, on our ethical conduct, is perhaps taking a more active stance in what we do. And of course, this fits in with ideas around socially engaged practice. It's not just a matter of not speaking in certain ways. It's also a matter of speaking out in certain ways when there is
Avoid
harm
evil, do
happening.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's an additional step that I think that perhaps sometimes doesn't get as much focus when we talk about right speech and right action and right livelihood, as we talk about avoiding things we don't talk about, or active pro-engagement with things.
So here's one that comes to mind. For example, oh, well, here's two. One, um, whatever one's sexual preference, because gender is not sex. Um, I think the question of queer dharma is on the table and really glaringly being ignored.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, for example, and that to look at it means, and I say, we're saying refraining from doing unwholesome things, doing wholesome things, and keeping a clear mind. So keeping a clear mind means, well, how do I see this in myself? And in identifying with someone who's in this position, well, gee, the leaders of so many groups aren't dealing with core questions like the rhetoric of outing someone or not outing someone, or even just approving of it. Another example that comes to mind is, our participation in a society that's a corporate culture. We have individuals and we have corporations that are treated as individuals.
yeah, and want to be recognized as individuals,
Well,
which
they
is
are. They've been granted personhood, which is the same right given to freed slaves. And recently, David Loy has put on the table a letter that he wrote to a practitioner who is also on the board of two large corporations, which David feels uh, very clearly endanger the ecosphere and thus, aren't practicing right livelihood. So that brings up the interesting question, as you're saying, to speak out. I think in terms of engagement, gives us the possibility of considering institutional change as occurring person by person, whether it's a person on the board or a secretary, a person who answers the phone, whoever you come in contact with, wherever the opportunity presents itself, even if it's just by our behavior, it has consequences.
yeah. I think it touches on two things. First is the idea that we speak up in under circumstances which may not even directly, at least on first blush, relate to us. We see, for example, in our communities, in our practice communities, that there is a great disparity in diversity. We're not representing our diverse society as a whole. We're not seeing this as along racial lines. We're not seeing this around gender preference lines. We're kind of missing that boat, and that's one reason why, at least on this podcast, even though I am a member of the privileged white male middle class, I still make a point of having episodes that bring this to light and talk about issues of diversity, because that is something that we see perhaps should be changed and could be supported. And the other thing I think you brought up, Gary, is just talking about how as we do have these ideas pushed forward, that how we do them moment by moment is still a choice, and the willful ignorance of some of these topics is something that I think that's where we need to spend some energy around. How do we change that willful ignorance?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about diversity, it means finding out doing homework and finding out what are the core dilemmas and history that various people who are different than us face, so that we don't have to ask them.
Mm-hmm.
And then in doing so, I think that certainly will open our own, widen our awareness and open our heart, and create the possibility of a listening, responsive circle or presence.
Yeah, it's not just about not speaking in a certain way. It's also about speaking in a certain way, speaking out against that which is demonstrably harmful, and speaking out for that which is demonstrably beneficial. I think that's a part that we really need to foster, because we don't put as much of a focus on that.
And listening.
And listening, and deep and sincere listening. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, without judging. And I appreciate your by the way, your commitment to that too, because I myself I don't know, I think it's been 20 years since I've just kind of shut up and have been listening to this incredible transformation in our society, historically, of hearing voices that have never been heard before. It's a wonderful time to be alive in that respect.
So, Gary, what are some of your thoughts around ways in which we can support this ongoing growth of, shall we say, proactive Sila?
My own practice is as an engaged practitioner, is informed by what's in front of my nose. It's not hard to find a situation in which I find something that I think is other than me, and the minute I recognize that I've done that, I see that in the mirror, I recognize a source of suffering, and I dive in and I learn more about what it was that I thought is other, whether it's race or gender or class. If you can't find any of those, it's always just like, well, spend some time volunteering in a hospital or something, ever it is, because just to go back to the real core, I think, initial impulse that still remains vital in the Buddha's teachings about this it's very easy to just practice generosity and kindness if we give that a chance. But to do that isn't necessarily as easy as we thought. It means, oh, I have to stop, and I have to, oh, this guy wants money from me, or what is it, a homeless person? And maybe I should just talk to him and find out what his story is. Even though, oh, I've got 5 minutes. Okay, who do I think I am that I don't have 5 minutes? And whatever it is, just to be kind and just to practice generosity and just to be open to the people and situations around us. I mean, to not do that, is that thing we were saying a couple of beats earlier about what a good meditator I am, and then building up this ego of self power. How does one do it? I think engaged practice is just whatever's in front of your nose. What do you think?
I think you're right. It has to do with our moment by moment choices, and part of that is an unflinching willingness, which is very hard to develop, and that's part of our practice, to see what's in front of us.
It's easy to turn away from suffering, right?
Yeah, very much so. And this is our friend Ron Stillman is putting out an article right now that he's working on for the website about fully knowing suffering and what we mean by that. And a lot of that is so much based on our awareness. And one reason we have these meditative practices that we do is to help us with our skills in observing what's going on in a very, very broad sense, in having a greater awareness of what's going around us, but also in being able to have vipassana and having insight into what's really going on. And that can be very uncomfortable at times, and that is part of the practice. It's not easy to do. Again, that's part of the practice. But as we get better at this, honestly, Gary, I imagine your experiences over the years may be very similar, is that when we really do engage with that with others, when we don't shy away from it and ignore it, but when we do put ourselves out there and have that active pro-social experience of another's hurt and compassionate engagement with it and kindness towards them and working towards changing things, that is one of the most rewarding and fulfilling and has the greatest positive set of consequences, even just on a personal level, let alone for that other individual or for our social context as a whole.
Yep.
Gary, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we break?
I think we could have another program, but no. I mean, one mouth is never enough to say all of it, but you've said a great deal and given me more than enough opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, for folks listening, I wanted to mention that I am linking to a couple of spots on this episode page, and one of the ones I wanted to share is Gary's homepage at www.word.to. So be sure to go check that out. Our guest today has been Gary Gach. Gary, thanks for being here again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a privilege, a pleasure, and a secularly Buddhist delight.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.